I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to take this call, and he's calling specifically for me.
I'm fine. I got coffee.
And then we'll dig on other things. So, Clarence, welcome to the show, kind of. We had a brief discussion before the show started where Clarence called me a narcissistic sociopath and then a coward. But he's got this point about the logical absolutes, which aren't absolutes, they're misnamed. And I'm happy to address it. So what's your point here, Clarence? Welcome.
Thank you, kind of. You have often made the point that one can either has to be convinced or unconvinced of the existence of a God. And the point I'd like to make is just very simple. In order to be convinced or unconvinced, the word convinced implies that you have considered the issue and are either convinced or unconvinced. However, it is possible for people to exist, and people have existed, and I can give several examples. People exist who are totally unfamiliar with the concept of a God. And someone who is totally unfamiliar and has never even been exposed to the concept of a God is neither convinced or unconvinced.
That's not true. That's not true.
The word unconvinced.
No, we're pausing right here. You seem to be confused in equating the notion of not being convinced with being disconvinced or something. All I'm saying is that for any proposition, you are either convinced of that proposition or you are not convinced. This is a/not a scenario, and those are the only options. And so if someone says, are you convinced of Fergalbergal? And you've never heard Fergalbergal, you don't know what a proposition is, then you cannot possibly be convinced of it. So you are still in the not convinced
category. You're neither convinced or unconvinced.
I know you're saying that. I know you're saying that, Clarence, but you're wrong. I have. Hey, would you stop talking and let me? Okay. Did you think we were going to agree, Clarence?
Don't know. I thought maybe you would consider my argument and agree with it.
I did consider it, and I'm explaining to you. I did consider it, and I'm explaining to you why it's wrong. Would you like me to do that, or do you want to just sit here and be confident in yourself without being rebutted?
I would be glad to listen to it. Go ahead.
Good. Then shut the fuck up.
Go ahead.
Okay. I have written down on my table here a proposition. You have no idea what that proposition is, do you? That was a question. Are you going to answer the question?
I have no idea what that proposition is.
Okay. Are you convinced that my proposition is true?
I am neither convinced or unconvinced because
that's not what I asked. That's not what I asked, you dishonest fuck. I said, are you in fact convinced that my proposition is true? That's a yes or no question.
I am neither convinced or unconvinced.
Clarence, this is a yes or no question. I didn't say, are you unconvinced? I said, are you convinced? And so if I say, are you convinced? And you say, I'm neither convinced, then your answer to my question is no, you are not convinced, correct?
Incorrect. I am neither convinced or unconvinced.
You are flat wrong, and I will explain this to people who are going to be honest and discuss it.
Clarence, I need you to stop. I need you to not use the word unconvinced again during this call because that's the problem. You're using this word unconvinced. What I need you to only use the phrase non-convinced, okay? Because the phrase unconvinced is where you're going completely off track. So just if you can not use that for the rest of the call and just say non-convinced, all right?
I have a statement written down. Do you believe that that statement is true? Are you in fact convinced that this statement is true right now?
I don't know because I don't know the statement.
No, you do know that you are not convinced.
No, the word convinced implies that I am familiar with the statement and that I've considered it.
Yes, in order to become convinced. Fine, I'm muting you. Yes, in order to become convinced, you have to be familiar with the statement. And then the weight of the evidence in favor of that proposition has convinced you. But until you've been presented with the proposition, you are not convinced. And until you've been presented with sufficient evidence, you are also not convinced. Not being convinced of a proposition does not mean that you are convinced the proposition is false. So let's see if we can agree on that. Would you agree that if person A is not convinced that the proposition is true, that does not mean that person A is convinced it's false?
Say that again.
Yeah, if you were listening, I wouldn't have to. Here we go.
The last part. Just the
shut
last
up.
part.
Here, let me mute you again. Paul. I won't even use abstractions.
Okay.
Paul has shit. Paul is not convinced that I have $1 million in the bank. Does that mean that Paul is convinced that I do not have $1 million in the bank? That's the question.
Has Paul been presented with the claim that you have?
Goodbye, Clarence. I'm sorry that you can't be honest in this discussion. That was a simple, straightforward question. Goodbye, sir. You can think I'm a sociopathic narcissist all you want. You can think that I'm a coward. I'm pretty decent at explaining complicated topics in a simple way, but sometimes someone like you comes along and it makes it impossible. This is a really simple question, and everybody else watching is able to answer it.
Right.
If Paul says that he is not convinced that I have $1 million, that does not mean that Paul is in fact convinced that I do not have $1 million. It's like saying, if I'm not convinced that you're innocent, that does not mean that I'm convinced you're guilty. I'm sorry that your confusion about this is so deep, but identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle are the presuppositional foundations of logic. They don't go away just because you haven't been presented with an idea. Meanwhile, your absurd point about the fact that there are people out there who've never been presented with a God concept is laughable. No, it's true. I mean, it's absolutely true that there are people out there, there's babies born every minute that haven't been presented with a God concept yet. But to suggest that this somehow undermines logic shows the depths that you're willing to go to not have to understand the difference between if I say, hey, we know for a fact that the number of blades of grass on the planet is either even or odd. And if Paul is not convinced that it's even, that does not mean that Paul is convinced it's odd. This is the basic, most simple foundations of logic. Identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. They apply to every proposition that there ever has been, ever could be, ever will be.
I was trying to force him down the line of dichotomy, but he did not want to be in a dichotomy.
Nope. Every time you do the I'm neither convinced nor unconvinced, every time you say that, just look at it. I'm neither convinced. That means I am not convinced.
Yeah.
And so your statement is self-contradictory. I'm neither convinced nor not convinced. Yes, you are. You're just really, really, really confused.